The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No disease had ever been so fatal or so hideous. The blood was the signal and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. Each of its victims felt sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then bleeding at the pores. The scarlet stains on the victim's body, especially on the face, were the warning that shut him out from aid and sympathy. No more than half an hour passed between the Red Death's first attack and the victim's grim death rattle. Prince Prospero was happy and fearless and clever. After half his subjects had died from the Red Death, he summoned 1,000 healthy and light-hearted friends from among the knights and ladies of his court. With these followers, he left for the deep seclusion of one of his giant castles. This castle was a magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own unusual tastes. A strong, high wall of iron gates protected it. The prince's followers, having entered, used furnaces and massive hammers to weld the gates shut. They resolved to keep themselves in and everyone else out. The castle had plenty of food and supplies. With such precautions, the prince's followers would defy the disease. The outside world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was foolish to grieve or to think the prince would... Yeah. The prince had provided all that was needed for pleasure. There were jesters, there were actors, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, and there was beauty, there was wine. All these, and security, were inside. Outside was the Red Death. Toward the end of the 5th or 6th month of the seclusion, and while the plague raged furiously throughout the lands, Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at the magnificent masked ball. It was a luxurious scene. First, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 rooms, all in a row, and all were strangely decorated to fit the prince's love of the bazaar. Each of the adjoining rooms had 3 high Gothic windows to the right, the left, and in the middle of each wall. The windows looked out over the hallway that led to each room. These windows were stained glass, the color of which matched the main color of the room. At one end of the castle, for instance, was a mostly blue room, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber had purple decorations and purple glass. The third was green throughout, and so were its panes. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th room was shrouded in black velvet. Tapestries hung over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds on the carpet of the same material and color. In this chamber only, the color of the windows did not match the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. In the hallway outside each window there stood a granite tripod that held a wide, shallow metal bowl. In each bowl was a blazing fire. Thus the rooms were glaringly lit, but in the black chamber the effect of the firelights that streamed through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly. It produced a wild look upon the faces of anyone who entered, though few dared to do so. In that same chamber, a gigantic ebony clock stood against one wall. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. When the hour struck, there came from the brass lungs of the clock a sound that was clear and loud and deep and musical. But it was so peculiar in note that each hour rang out, the musicians of the orchestra were forced to stop their music and listen to the sound. The party guests were also forced to stop their waltzing, and there was a brief uneasiness among the light-hearted company. While the chimes of the clock rang, even the cheeriest person grew pale. People who were more aged and thoughtful passed their hands over their brows as if in confused meditation. When the echoes had fully ceased, everyone broke out once again in gay laughter. The musicians looked at each other and smiled and made whispering vows to each other that they would ignore the next chiming of the clock. After another 60 minutes passed, however, there came another chiming of the clock, and there was the same uneasiness and meditation as before. In spite of these things, it was a jolly and magnificent party. The prince's peculiar taste had dictated the sort of costumes his party guests wore. There were much ghostly glare and glitter. There were oddly shaped figures with unusual limbs and features. There was the delirious touches of a madman. There was much of the beautiful, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and a great deal that could cause disgust. It seemed as though the 7 colorful chambers where the party was held were stocked by dreams. Dreams that drifted in and out, taking form from rooms and causing the orchestra's wild music to seem like an echo of their steps. And always there were the hourly strikes of the ebony clock. At those times all was still, all was silent for the clock. The dreams went stiff, frozen as they stood, until the echoes of the chime died away. They lasted but an instant. Then a light laughter floated after them as they departed. Through it all, none of the masqueraders went into the black room. For as the night slipped away, the bloodier light shone through the scarlet window panes. The blackness of the curtains was appalling. The other rooms were crowded. In them the heart of the life beat feverishly. The party went whirling on until finally there began the sounding of the midnight upon the clock. Then the music stopped, as I have said, and the waltzers grew quiet. There was an uneasy end of all things before. At the same time, many a party guests noticed a masked figure who had caught no one's attention until now. The rumor of this new presence spread around, creating a buzz of whispers. At first, people were surprised and disapproving, but they quickly became repulsed and terrified. In an assembly of ghosts such as the one I have described, no ordinary costume could have caused such a sensation. But this figure had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's strange designs. It was tall and hungry-looking, and shrouded from head to foot in the clothes of the grave. The mask that concealed the face looked so much like a stiffened corpse that it was impossible to figure out where the mask began and ended. Yet all of this might have been endured, if not approved, by the wild party guests around, but for one thing. The masquerader had gone so far as to imitate the symptoms of the Red Death. His clothes were dabbled in blood. His brow and his facial features were sprinkled with a scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fall upon this ghastly image, his guests saw him shudder with either terror or distaste. The The next instant, his face reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of his followers. "Who dares to insult us with this mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise." Prince Prospero stood in the blue chamber as he uttered these words. His words rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and all musicians and every guest had become hushed at the waving of his hand. Despite such a bold, clear command, nobody put forth a hand to seize the intruder. Instead, he walked slowly and deliberately towards Prince Prospero. The masquerader passed within a yard of the prince, but the vast assembly of guests shrank away from the centers of the rooms and toward the walls. The newcomer strode uninterrupted. He moved deliberately, solemnly through each chamber until he had almost reached the final one of black. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero became maddened with rage over its own momentary cowardice. He rushed towards the masquerader, following him through each of the rooms. Not one followed the prince, on account of the deadly terror that had seized all. Prince Prospero held a dagger over his head and had approached within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure. But just as the masquerader reached the black chamber, he turned suddenly and faced the pursuing prince. There was a sharp cry, and a gleaming dagger dropped upon the black carpet. Instantly afterwards, Prince Prospero fell dead beside it. Summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the prince's followers threw themselves into the black chamber and seized the masquerader. They gasped in unspeakable horror when they found that the grave clothes and corpse-like mask they had handled so violently were empty. Now everyone understood that they were in the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night. One by one, he dropped the party-goers in the blood-dabbled halls of their revel. And the life of the ebony clock went out, and the flames of the huge tripods went out, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held absolute power over all.